she'll shake your windows and rattle your walls. But the times they are changing. Yes, they're changing.
Something I heard one time on Dan Carlin's Common Sense podcast has really stuck with me. Now, in the context, he was talking about criticizing the United States government, but he said, it occurred to me that we have to step back and really look at this from another point of view, because if all we're doing is criticizing something, no matter what it is, an organization, an institution, whether it be the government, or in the case of many people who have come out of, let's say, Christianity, for example, ex-evangelicals like my guest Daniel Hobbs in this episode today. And what Dan Carlin said is, he said, okay, you have to step back and ask a question or two. When you are critiquing an organization or an institution like the Evangelical Church, we have to ask what it is we think we want to accomplish by our criticism. Because, of course, as we all know, it's all too easy to sit back and just criticize virtually anything, whether it be an institution like the church or the government, a sporting team, could be anything. We can sit around and just criticize all the time. But what does criticism alone get us? What does it actually accomplish? Is it healthy? Is it productive? For example, you can take a look at historical examples of times in the past where people have deconstructed or questioned the establishment, whatever that might be at the time, whether it be in the music world, the art world, or religious world, whatever it might be. You can criticize the establishment. You can even tear it down. But then you got to ask the question, what happens when we get there? What happens when we achieve what we think we need to achieve? And this is the case, I think, something I learned from talking with people like Daniel Hobbs, who is very active on Twitter, along with some others in the ex-evangelical or ex-evangelical community. He's very kind of on the front lines, if you will. Him and some other people have really gone down this road of questioning and even criticizing a lot of things within evangelicalism and sort of posting up, making their feelings and their experiences known in terms of their backstory, which is what we're going to get into a little bit in this episode, part 1 today. Daniel's kind of backstory. Where did he come from? What were his experiences, and how did those experiences in evangelicalism, Bible college, and being a youth pastor, how did they shape him? Where is he at in terms of his own deconstruction of his former Christian faith? And how does all of that somehow relate to where he's at now in terms of being sort of an up-and-coming Twitter personality, for lack of a better word, on the forefront of this ex-evangelical or ex-evangelical movement? What is it exactly? That's what I want to try to get my head around and help you, the listener, understand a little bit more about what this thing is, because there's a trend, there's a movement, there's something happening. There's no question about it. And that's why I've called this episode and next, I call it Voices from the Ex-Evangelical World, because we want to hear more and more and more voices of people that are coming out of evangelicalism, fundamentalism. What has it done to them, and how has that shaped them going forward? And there's a lot of different responses. This is something I've done a lot of work on as well, is looking at where people go post the church, after they've left the church, after they perhaps left the Christian faith in some cases. Where are they headed along this road of spiritual journeying or deconstruction, whatever you want to call it, whatever name you want to attach to it? And we also have to ask, why is any of this important? Is this important? Well, it's absolutely important. I think it is, to continue having these discussions and these conversations with people like Daniel and some of the other guests that I've had on this podcast, and more guests that I'm going to have in the future, because we're hearing voices, we're hearing perspectives, we're hearing points of view. And as I've said before, deconstruction looks different for everybody. There's no right or wrong. There's no good or bad. It's a case of what is it that's working for you, and where are you heading? Maybe you don't even know, but listening to people like Daniel and other guests that I've had on this show, it's very important, because it allows you to kind of interact with different perspectives and go, yes, I agree with some of that. No, I don't agree with that. But why? Why do you agree? Why do you disagree? And where are you coming from on this journey as well? And where are you heading? Maybe you don't know, and that's fine. It's all part of the process. It's all part of this thing we call deconstruction, for lack of a better word. And this is something that I really appreciate about my conversation with Daniel, is that he's not just criticizing the evangelical church, although he certainly does do that, but we talk about this idea of where are we going, where do we want to go, where do we want to end up, and what happens when we get there, if indeed there is anywhere special along this journey. I am glad that you've joined me on this journey. I am your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, and you are listening to Mind Shift Podcast. And I'm glad that you've joined me because, as I've said many, many times, I am nothing more than a fellow traveler with you along the road of deconstruction and discovery, if indeed that describes you. And I'm happy to be bringing you this episode today with Daniel Hobbs. So let's hear what Daniel has to say as we listen to part 1 of Voices from the Ex-Evangelical World. I'm joined by Daniel Hobbs. You're coming all the way from Nashville. You said Nashville, Tennessee, not Nashville. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I'm definitely not going to be the one debating pronunciations of cities. I will get into a lot of trouble if we start doing that. But
yeah, you're from Nashville.
I can pretty much go with the flow in any setting I'm in. I'll just kind of mimic what everybody else is saying about it.
Yeah, you'll just roll it. A true Nashvilleian would not say that. That's just not
one of those battles I'm willing to fight anymore.
Yeah.
I was willing to fight those kind of battles at 19 years old. Seems a lot less important now.
It's true. Yeah, we got to ask those questions. Is this a hill worth dying on? Is it? And I there was a lot of hills that I died on when I was younger that I look back now and I think, what the hell was I thinking? Not important anymore. Really? You know?
I do that just about what I did yesterday pretty much daily. So whatever I did yesterday, I'm like, well, was that worth it?
Was that a hill worth dying on? It was yesterday. It seemed really important yesterday, but yeah, I know the older I get, the less I care about, what people think of me. And, it's true. I've hit 50 and then that was kind of the last straw for me. I'm like, you know what? Screw this. I don't care anymore. I've been married a long time and I'm not really trying to impress anybody. So, it's just one of those things, isn't it? So yeah, you're coming to us from Nashville.
I'm very much concerned with impressing people, though. I don't want anybody hearing this to think otherwise. I want to impress everyone.
You want to impress everyone.
I'm just very bad at it most of the time.
Yeah. Now we've kind of sort of connected on Twitter, I guess. You are part of the Ex-Evangelical Facebook group, but you were saying just before we hit record button, you're not as active on it as you once were. I think we're going to get into your kind of Twitter platform, if you will. You're very vocal about the evangelical church, the state of the church, and your experiences in Bible college and all that. And I'm really interested to get into your backstory. Do you want to just dive right into that, and then we can get into what you hope to accomplish on Twitter, where you think this movement's going, if it is indeed a movement, and what happens when we get there? I guess that's the real question, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a lot of things. So my background, if I was going to go through it kind of briefly, it would be I was born in Columbia, South Carolina. My dad was, at the time, a youth minister in a Baptist church and still going to seminary. And we moved. He was a youth minister for a while at different churches. And then he joined up with a missions organization where we went to the Bahamas for a couple of years. He stayed with that organization when we came back stateside. And then he became a pastor of a small evangelical church in Texas when I was 10. And I went to that church and grew up there in Palestine, Texas, which is a really little town in East Texas, until I graduated high school. And for me, coming up on graduating high school, I did not really know what I wanted to do. I thought I kind of wanted to do psychology, and in evangelical circles, and people will obviously push back on me on this a lot if they're in the evangelical world and say that they don't push against stuff this hard, especially the moderate evangelicals I grew up with. They like to think of themselves as a part of regular society in a lot of ways, but psychology is one of those buzzwords that kind of tips everybody. You go, oh, are you going to go into one of those and become one of those people that doesn't believe anymore because you just believe in psychology now and that this is all a delusion or something? So I ended up being encouraged to go to Bible college, where I realized after talking with the psychology department that I did not want to go immediately into grad school after college and do all the things you have to do to use psychology immediately. So I decided to become a youth ministry major along with my Bible major. And it was 3.5 years. I cranked it through quickly. I got married in that time. And then after that, I was pretty burned out on a lot of evangelical stuff, but was still only really qualified to do church youth ministry work by the end of college. I ended up getting a youth ministry position at a PCUSA church there in Columbia, South Carolina, where I was. And for me, that expanded a lot of things theologically because they were much more open and affirming as far as their theology goes, though there were definitely some hypocrisies in that. But the thing that was most disturbing to me was that the culture was exactly the same as the evangelical churches I was raised in. It just had some differences in theology. But the overall culture of silencing dissenting voices, the overall culture of mostly wealthy white people being in charge of all of the decision making and what we were doing. And for me, it was almost more hypocritical at times because at least I knew what evangelicals' intentions were, but when I would be a part of this supposedly liberal theology world, I would be in these churches that would tell me about social justice every week, but we were spending an insane amount of money to keep our building going each week. And we were spending an insane amount of money paying our staff, and we were spending an insane amount of money on landscaping. And we were spending a really insane amount of money on a new organ. And at that point, I just thought, there's no way that that's social justice. This doesn't make sense.
So you saw a major disconnect in that sense, right? Between the core values that the church claimed to stand for, and yet what they were actually doing in reality was, as you say, spending stupid amounts of money on maintenance and buildings and salaries and everything. So very little of it was actually going to take care of the people that needed it on the streets.
Right.
And,
I mean,
marginalized.
there was always so many times that a person could come into the church looking for financial help, and we turned them away because that very tiny part of our budget had been used up for the month while we were spending it on all of these other things, that I could stand to look at myself, really. It was a complete mockery of everything that it claimed to be at times.
And you were on staff at this church at the time. Did you ever voice any of these concerns that you had with the leadership of the church?
I did. There's the problem with being in a Presbyterian circle is it's basically like being a part of the U.S. government, because the Presbyterians were started by they started in America by, like, they started their branch basing everything off of the federal government and the state governments. And so basically Presbyterian politics is this giant thing that goes all the way down to the ground level of your church, but it's also this giant national thing where decisions are made for everybody. And there's lots of steps in between that. So anytime you present things that are dissenting against the way it's going or that imply radical change, you're going to meet the same frustrations that you meet in the bureaucracy of government.
So this church had a massive national kind of synod, or whatever you want to call it, a national government so you had all these layers and layers of government. I forget what they call it because I really didn't give a shit at the time. Right.
But they had a lot of stuff. They had the state of South Carolina had 3 different areas that would meet sometimes, and then there was a national convention every 3 years or so. And basically all of the church government, it was things that you would do at your local church, and then that would go to the big group, and then that would go to the slightly bigger group, kind of passed it all the way up until they made decisions on the national level. And there's some autonomy to the churches individually within that, but it was just incredibly frustrating because within even an individual church in a particular town, you have so many committees and subcommittees and just red tape everywhere.
Yeah, so everything you want to do is
infuriating to try to do anything.
It's really cumbersome to try to change anything on the local level, because you've got so many layers and layers and layers of committees and red tape and everything. So you can voice your concerns to the leadership of that local church, but you're not going to get very far. So what ended up happening? Did you voice your concerns and then leave, or what ended up happening?
Well, it was a combination of things. I had voiced concerns over my time there. I was also learning a lot while I was there, but I was also in my own process of deconstructing faith in general while I was being a youth minister at a church. It was a very conflicting feeling, to slowly be ripping away parts of your faith that you thought were essential while continuing to be asked to do a lot, give a lot of yourself for something that you're not sure you believe in anymore.
What was it that started you on that deconstruction process? How did you get involved in that?
Get involved in what?
Well, the deconstruction. I mean, for me, it was a case of I was the head pastor of a church in Portland. I was experiencing frustrations with the church similar to what you were talking about, working with the eldership of the church and all that. But then I was also reading books like Donald Miller, Searching for God Knows What. I read Brian McLaren's A New Kind of Christian. And that's what started me and my wife on this path of questioning pretty much everything. So how did it start for you?
I think it's a couple of things. I think pretty much everything I'm going to mention from early on in my deconstruction is a group that I have since found a lot of tension with. Or a person that I find a lot of tension with what I believe now and what they believe, but I do also recognize the place that they had in starting me down this road in the first place. So there's a couple of things. You mentioned Donald Miller. I would say Blue Like Jazz, when I was still in Bible college,
was
a pretty big revelation to me. I thought that I was finally finding something that was open and gracious and at least closer. Somebody has once told me, just look at the man you want to be and decide if something is taking a step closer there or a step further away. And reading those books made me feel like I was taking a step closer to being the person I wanted to be. So reading that, occasionally reading Rob Bell, and just trying to listen to people that were not saying the same thing everybody else was a big deal. And then I remember while I was working at this church, I was a big fan of the band Thrice. And I remember their lead singer going on this podcast called the Bad Christian Podcast. And I heard it, and these guys were like, swearing, talking about porn in an honest way for themselves, all these different things that related to me then. And I started to at least, the one good takeaway I got from that was to just start being honest with myself about everything. And the one thing that I have always taken away that the pastor of that church told me, she told me one time, if you're searching for truth and God is true, then you'll find God. And I thought that was a very profound statement, because it takes away the fear of searching for truth and feeling like you're betraying God, which is what I had thought for most of my life.
You're not walking away from God. You might be actually walking toward Him in that sort of journey of deconstruction. One of the weird ironies, for sure.
Now I just am quite nihilistic most days, but at least at the time I thought maybe I was coming closer to an actual answer.
Yes, you're looking for answers, and you're reading some books. Now it's got to be a difficult place to be, though, because you're in leadership. I've talked to a lot of people who got in trouble, in leadership, and then they voiced some doubts, voiced maybe some concerns they had about their nice airtight theology or the way they interpret the Bible at that church. Did you ever get in trouble for? It sounds like they were a little bit more receptive, at least this pastor was.
Yeah, they were receptive on the theological end. I had to do a lot of if you go back on my blog, which we can talk about at some point later, but if people go back, there's like a ton of posts from the time when I was still working at the church that have a giant disclaimer at the top that it's not the opinion of that church.
You had to put that in there.
That was something that we sat down in a meeting. They're like, we are okay with you talking about these things, but you're going to have to say at the beginning of each thing that this is not the official position of our church, because I would just say whatever I was actually thinking.
So there was some restrictions.
They were more receptive to that than they were to when I started calling out the system itself.
And now you're in trouble.
Being just the theological debate.
Because, yeah, that's highly abstract, isn't it? I mean, we can talk about theology and God and all that. But when you start talking about where you spend your money as a church, and
right.
that suddenly is confronting people where they live, really, isn't it? So, yeah, now you've got a problem because you're saying, wait a minute, why are we spending money on an organ and all this, the beautiful landscaping and all the rest of it? Where's this going?
Right. Well, I think, that for me, that was a conversation I was having internally with people for well over a year before I resigned. And then there was a post that I made not long after I left the church. My basic theory, and the title of that post was, has the church become the rich young ruler? Which is something I joke about on Twitter a lot. And I make kind of funny meme-style jokes about it that people share sometimes. But essentially, I think that if you take a lot of the narrative in the Gospels and a lot of the interactions Jesus had with individuals, and you applied those conceptually to the church as an institution instead of using it to further guilt and shame individuals, then you find a very interesting theme, because you'll find that the church is actually going against what Jesus is fighting for on almost every level. So even the more progressive Christians who say and do the right things but have these elaborate structures where money is spent this way, I find that Jesus would have turned to their better theology and said, okay, but just sell all of this stuff and give it to the poor.
What about that?
I've theorized for a long time that if American churches all took the money that they spend on all these other things and just spent it on ending homelessness, that homelessness wouldn't exist anymore.
We could certainly put a big dent in it. I know it's a complex issue for sure, but there's a lot of money, millions and billions of dollars being spent every year on building and aesthetics and maintenance and grounds and organs and stained glass windows and elevators or, escalators in your lobby to get you up to the top floor. And I think, I've said that before too, that one of my favorite books is The Robe by Lloyd C. Douglas. It was made into a big, huge Hollywood blockbuster movie back in the 60s, I think it was. And the movie bears no resemblance to the book, but the book is amazing because he talks about, it's a guy who comes into Jerusalem right around the time of just before they crucify Jesus. And it's an amazing story, but the critique of the temple system at the time is, I think it's a criticism of the church of today for the same exact reasons, the wealth and the money. And he talks about seeing these priests in their beautiful robes with jewels on them, literally stepping over the poor and the beggars on the street to get to the temple because they've got such important things to do for God that they could end this poverty if they wanted to. But they don't. They don't want to, or they don't think it's, it's part of God's plan. These people, that's their lot in life, I guess. I don't know. But it's an interesting thing, isn't it? How does this bear any resemblance to what we could, I guess you could say, the simple message of Jesus? I mean, Jesus was homeless. Jesus didn't have any money, really. He was a grassroots movement.
It's hard for me because that's kind of my pushback on evangelicalism, but then, again, I do have some pushback to the simplicity of the message of Jesus, because as I read the Gospels, there are so many times that I'm thinking, yeah, I'm right on board with you there, Jesus, until you said that, and now that just doesn't make sense, and now you're being a little authoritative and scary.
Where are you at with that?
Maybe relax.
How do you read the Bible? I mean, because that's something that's come up quite a bit lately with different guests that I've had. Part of this deconstruction process sort of by default means that you have to change your hermeneutic, that sort of lens, through which you're reading the Bible. Do you feel like you're changing the way you see the scripture, or do you even read the Bible at all?
I say that, I spent a lot of time reading the Bible, so I don't do it as much. My basic place right now is pretty agnostic towards whether or not there is any sort of God at play in all of this. But what I've come to settle on is, if there is a creative force that created me, I'm going to be comfortable with that force understanding why I can't do that right now, why I can't even look to see if it's there. I'm just going to kind of live like it's not there, to be honest.
Yeah.
But when I look at the Bible, I see it as an opportunity to use these texts subversively. So for me, when I look at something that I had to memorize 10 years ago, or something I had to sit and study in hermeneutics and learn that there was some sort of exegesis, what I like to do is expose what I see as a fallacy of exegesis. And I know a lot of people, this is where the evangelicals and the progressive Christians unite to hate me, is when I say there really isn't an exegesis. I get really postmodern on them.
Right.
There's too much that you're bringing to the table every time you read it. And even
absolutely.
if you study it super in depth and you learn Greek and Hebrew, no matter what you do, you keep building up all these skills to try to get the right answer out of the text. And you still bring a lot of your assumptions to it every time, and you're never going to eliminate your bias.
Absolutely.
So I find it more important, as we all enter into our collective eisegesis project, to take something positive and useful and helpful to the world away from everything, rather than continue to argue with people who want to use it destructively. I'm just no longer interested in talking to them.
Well, I think it's fascinating. This is something that Josh de Keyser, he was on the podcast a few weeks ago. He's from the Netherlands, and he studied theology in the States. And he said that the truth is if you look at church history, the Bible has been interpreted in the same exact passages. Each generation thought it had it totally figured out. You know, they thought they had the answer. They thought they had the text mastered. And yet the next couple of generations later, they came up with a completely different interpretation from the same exact text. So it's clear that there is no one single interpretation. As you say, we all bring our biases, our presuppositions into everything. You know, it's not just the Bible, it's everything. We have a worldview, and that's how we see the world. Whatever those filters are, we're going to filter it through that, aren't we?
Yeah, always. I think that's true. And I think that's why you're going to have a hard time if we started to talk about what the ex-evangelical people are doing right now, is we're kind of doing that with our experience with evangelicalism. We're all looking back on it, and we have different takeaways from what hurt us. We have different takeaways about what might have been positive about it. We have different takeaways on whether or not any of it was real. And as those things come to light and the more complex questions come to light, I think it's going to be very hard to imagine that we're all going to join up together to start some new movement. And I don't even know that I want it to look like a movement that's anything as strong in the way that it comes down on people as evangelicalism was to me.
It can certainly happen. It's the pendulum of history, isn't it? It swings from extreme to extreme. And this is the same thing in theology too. You see that pendulum swinging from conservatism to extreme liberalism, back to extreme conservatism, back to extreme liberalism. It's been many, many times in the past where we've seen that reactionary movement back and forth. So are we in the middle of a reactionary movement in the ex-evangelical community? And if so, then where's it going to end up going? Because we can sit here and bash on the church forever. And in some ways, it's kind of an easy target. And I agree. We need to validate the experiences that people have had. I feel like I was burned out as a pastor. I was screwed up as a kid. I have all kinds of problems related to my background in evangelicalism. And I don't know if that describes you. I mean, do you feel like you were burned, you were hurt in the system? Because you said you resigned from the church, but where did you go from there?
Yeah. So I pretty much kind of slowly, right after that, it just kind of, the last pieces of it came to the point where I think once I discarded theologies of hell and discarded even being willing to debate the humanity and validity of LGBTQ people, once I let go of those things, it was just, for me, there was nothing left to try to hang on to. I didn't need to debate it anymore. If there was something true about it, it could find me. And if not, I've spent a lot of time searching, and I just kind of want to live for a bit. I want to be alive and present in this moment and not miss it searching for something that may not even exist. So that's kind of where I got to. But also, yeah, there's a ton of hurt, and there's a lot of things that I spent years burying inside of myself that, yeah, it comes out harshly a lot of times as you're processing trauma. And then there's also just the insane amount of conversations I've had since publicly saying that I am an ex-evangelical person, and the hundreds and hundreds of people I've talked to since then. What I find is there's so many people with such extreme pain and suffering due to that religious structure that when I am coming out on fire against the church, it's because I'm trying to create some elbow room for some other people to exist and know that their voice can exist, as well as validate my own self as an authentic person. So yeah, there are times where I'm just on the burn it down train, and there's other times where I do wonder what we're going to do next. I just find that I don't know that I'm the person to decide, or even, I don't even know if I have an opinion yet. I just know that I can't go back to what I was in, and I don't know where I stand now, because as I look at ex-evangelicals, you get groups of them that are progressive Christians, and you get groups of them that are hardline atheists, and I have common ground with each of those groups, and I have common ground with people of different spiritual practices, people that go into Buddhism, people that go into paganism. I have some common ground with all of those people because of being ex-evangelical, but most of the time I feel what I like to call spiritually homeless in that world, because I don't know that many people that don't really believe in any higher power, but also aren't willing to be thrown into the constant atheist Christian debate circle either.
It doesn't have to be a binary opposition, does it? I think it's been helpful in this article that I wrote, What Happens After People Leave the Church. I've identified 13 possible responses to what happens after people leave the church, and I'm always adding more to the list all the time. And I see it's kind of like a spectrum, really. And a lot of the points you just described are some of the ones I've identified where people go. And a lot of times they'll start out in one place and then they'll move to another. And it's not necessarily that one place is better than another. You could start out, because I started out as a person, I didn't want to have anything to do with the church anymore, but I was still very, very passionate about the church. I wanted to reform it from outside, but then I gave up on that. So I've shifted a little bit down the spectrum. You know, I'm not in that place anymore, but I was. I mean, that's why I started this podcast a year and a half ago. I was really, I wanted to get my material out there to help the church, but they didn't want to know. So, yeah, and I was deconstructing.
They don't usually.
Yeah, I was deconstructing too. And the more I went down this road, I thought, I can't do this anymore. In fact, no one seemed to care really. So I kind of gave up on that project. And I've deconstructed, as Richard Jacobs had said, I've deconstructed in front of a live audience, you know, so I have a lot in common with Sam Morse, who was on here a couple weeks ago. He's this Out of Eden podcast, because he's just charting his own journey on a podcast of deconstruction. So it's quite cool. So yeah, that's the question. Where do you hope to go with, okay, because a person could look at your Twitter feed and say, look, here's Daniel. All he does is bash on the church and say negative things. And I mean, I say the same things. We do the Christian alt facts and ex-evangelical and empty the pews and being ex-evangelical. And, you know, sometimes I really get into those campaigns too, but what's the end game? Where are you going with it? And you said you want to create some elbow room for other people, but it's got to be more than that, surely.
I think that it's a combination of things. I think I walked into this over the last 3 months, this point where now all of a sudden people see what I say on Twitter. And it's a new space for me, because people didn't really ever before this. And not many people were around listening to what I was saying in general. So having an audience is something that I'm trying to adjust to. Not that I have a giant audience, but now that anybody is listening, something I'm adjusting to is how do I maintain the authenticity of everything that I said before these people were listening? Because my biggest fear is becoming someone who's addicted to the attention that certain things bring me. And I don't want to be that. I don't want to be here patting myself on the back because I know how to craft a tweet that the people who already like all the stuff I say are going to like.
Yeah, they're going to retweet it.
But what I do enjoy doing is just describing the world that I see. And for me, I've been most successful doing that on Twitter, but as someone who writes, I try to put together my thoughts on my blog, and I'm working on some other projects right now that hopefully I'll be able to talk about soon, but they're not official yet. So
they're in the works.
But I work on doing things through writing. I also just kind of spread myself all over the place. But I see myself more in the creative world than I do in the organizing and figuring out what to do with a movement world. And so all I know how to do is describe what I'm seeing.
The beauty of what Daniel Hobbs is saying, I think, at least in my estimation anyway, is he's not looking to lead a movement. He's not looking to start a revolution. He's just describing what he's seeing. Maybe he's more of a facilitator of dialogue, a facilitator of discussion, putting people together in this ex-evangelical or ex-evangelical community. Now, again, I said before at the introduction, where are we going with this thing? What do we want to do when we get there? What does it look like? And the answer, at least so far, as I've talked with Daniel, is maybe we don't know. In fact, this movement, this ex-evangelical movement or post-evangelical, whatever you want to call it, people who have left the church behind, people who are deconstructing their faith or maybe contemplating deconstructing their faith. And perhaps this describes you. Maybe you're still sitting in that church pew, but you're thinking, you're questioning, you're asking a lot of questions, and maybe you haven't verbalized them yet, but those questions are in your mind. Maybe you're getting tired of living with the cognitive dissonance. And that's why, as I said before, this is important to hear voices from the ex-evangelical world, people like Daniel Hobbs, because one of the things that really clearly comes across, at least to me, is that Daniel is not just a reactionary. He's not a rabid, angry person. In fact, his own experiences in evangelicalism were actually fairly moderate. Yes, he saw a lot of problems and hypocrisies and inconsistencies within the church where he was a youth pastor, but he wasn't totally burned and burned out like so many of us were. I was a pastor and an elder for 12 years and a youth pastor before that. I was both burned and burned out in both ministry and in teaching, which I did for a long time over here in the UK. And I got tired of propping up the system. I loved certain aspects of it, but when I come out of it and I criticize the evangelical church and a lot of the system that it's become, I can be a lot more passionate maybe than someone like Daniel. And that's what I appreciate. He's not just blowing holes in an institution just for the sake of blasting something, although he says he can be quite vocal and quite ready to burn stuff down. So there's always different perspectives. There's always different points of view. And it's important, as I say, to learn how to think critically and to work your way through some of these various positions and perspectives. I'm glad you've joined me and Daniel Hobbs for this episode, part 1. Part 2, we're going to get into a little bit more of the ex-evangelical movement, what it's all about and how Daniel sees it, how he's connecting various people within the movement, as amorphous as it might be, and some of the hashtags that are really trending. And if you want to be a part of that, you can always follow Daniel. His Twitter handle is @HobbsIsMe. That's HOBBSISME. Hobbs is me. You can also connect with me too on Twitter at Mindshift2018. And as always, there's a variety of ways to contact me in terms of social media, and those links are always in the show notes. So have a look there. If you want to send me an email or get a hold of me on Facebook, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. And again, if you have any thoughts, comments, or feedback, please send them my way. And I would love to interact with you and chat with you further. Whatever you think of this episode or any other, feel free to let me know. And also, I would ask you for a favor. Please leave a review of this podcast on either iTunes or Podbean, whichever platform you subscribe to, and that will help with the show's visibility and ratings. So that would be great if you could do that for me. I would really appreciate it. All right, I will catch you next Friday for part 2 with Daniel Hobbs as we listen to voices from the ex-evangelical world right here on Mindshift Podcast.